So I think now we are 13 persons. That's a good number for beginning. So again, good morning to everybody. I'm very pleased that you are here despite summer break, or perhaps you are here thanks to summer break, I don't know. So I want to welcome you to our second international colloquium of the Institute Cultures of Alps, Kulturen der Alpen, Culture des Alpes, Culture delle Alpi. I will do that always because now we register. Yes, I especially welcome those who could not attend the first colloquium last time. The reading of the introduction of Morton's book raised several questions to which I would like to provide answers with this selection of text I gave you. I would like to arrange the questions in 4 fields and to discuss them each separately. I hope that you can see my presentation now. So, first the questions. What is really the hyperobject? That was one really big question last time. Then how should we react? Third, what is the function of language and meta-language? And where are we actually? I'm aware that the questions are not of a dialectical nature, but that doesn't matter. We know about the connections. I know that I triggered you with the following keywords and quotes in the invitation to our colloquium today. So that's, for example, I'm sorry because I cannot see my presentation, so it's a little bit strange for me. So the first keywords were about spatiality and temporality of the hyperobject. Then I quote, second, radical asymmetry between urgency and the cognitive weirdness. Thirdly, the feeling of unreality. So let's, I'd like to suggest to discuss the following 4 topics with you each, let's say during 10 to 15 minutes. And yes, I name the topics. So the first topic would be phasing. So I refer to the pages you read for today, 69 to 73. Then second, I call it Hypocrises 1, ecological awareness as intimacy, 134 to 139. Then Hypocrises 2, beyond cynicism. Oh, I'm so weird now, I lost it. And last question, or yes, last point, last topic, it's about marks, it's about equal temperament, it's about music. So let's start with the first topic, phasing. So I refer to the pages 69 to 73 in order that you can just read it in your texts. It's always a pity if you are exposed only to pixels of an artwork and not to its materiality itself. This is especially the case here with Pangati's artwork Untitled 2011. Here we can only guess what Morton means by object as subject, or by slice of the dream time as a part of the Aborigines hyperobject. Especially in connection with our last topic, number 4, equal temperament, it is worth to notice or to realize that emotional reactions is, quote, drenched in its resonance. From this follows the generalization, I quote, hyperobjects are phased. They occupy a high-dimensional phase space that makes them impossible to see as a whole on a regular 3-dimensional human scale basis. In order to conclude this first topic, I just want to show you 2 further examples explained by Morton. First, the daffodil flower as a 3-dimensional map of an algorithm executed by DNA and RNA in the genome. And for Morton, it shows the, I quote, the transdimensional quality. We only see snapshots. Oh, today I'm not so good in handling between presentation and this weird Zoom. So we only see snapshots of what is actually a very complex plot of super complex set of algorithms executing themselves in a high-dimensional phase space. When the weather falls on your head, you are experiencing a bad photocopy of a piece of that plot, a caricature of a piece of global climate. Second, and here we come to the mountains as hyperobjects, the poem Mont Blanc, written by Percy Shelley. Actually, for whom who is not in English studies, Percy Shelley is the husband of Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein. So if you just take the first verses, you can understand what Morton means by the mountain, like a beacon coming in and out of phase. The everlasting universe of things flows through the mind and rolls its rapid waves, now dark, now glittering, now reflecting gloom, now lending splendor wherefrom secret springs. So let's now discuss the question. Please just last remark, before your first thought you want to give in, mention your name and your affiliation. So let's discuss what is really the hyperobject. Feel free. Yes, Eva.
I guess I'll just start. Start us off with something that I noticed on the first page. My name is Eva Müller and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of American Studies at Innsbruck University. And my approach to mountain studies is a post-colonial one. And what struck me on the first page was the way Morton interprets that image that you shared with us, that we see on the left of this slide. And in the second paragraph, he talks about the Aboriginal hyperobject. And I wonder whether his conceptualization of hyperobjects are guilty of an allochronic discourse that we know from Johannes Fabian, time and the other. I wonder whether he is saying that there are Aboriginal hyperobjects and non-Aboriginal hyperobjects. Don't they bind us all? And I wonder how you understood that and how you read that and how it influenced your understanding of his definition of hyperobjects. Because it was something where, yeah, I stumbled on that formulation.
Do you have first hints or first answers to your questions?
Excuse me?
Have you first hints or first, yes, answers? What do you suppose?
Well, I think it, if we think about it in connection to facing, we sort of really have to look at the perspective of time and look at linearity versus circularity, and I wonder how the hyperobject repeats sort of the binaries that that romantic approaches and colonial approaches to mountains and to time have, well, is reinforcing in a way. Yeah.
I would just like to maybe contribute one observation, and that's I think Morton does a very interesting. Oh, sorry, it looks like the airplane's flying again, or it sounds like. In developing the multi or trans-dimensionality of hyperobjects, Morton takes various routes, I think, many of which one is the meta language versus meta language approach. Another one appears to be an aesthetic one that it probes various art forms for their virtuality or their capacities of developing or making new dimensions visible. And so I think the hyperobject, to begin with, maybe as a preliminary definition, could be the attempt to define an object in its multidimensionality. And what's interesting is how he develops this and what sort of trajectory he uses. And of course, as a film scholar, I was very much attracted to his reflections on cinema, and I think that that is, for me, the most obvious point where he wants to go. So he outlines a dimensionality that ultimately ends with algorithm as the most abstract, the most ideal, in a way, dimensionality. And so I thought the passage on cinema was very interesting to see the multidimensionality. So the way I understand it is, how do we arrive at different dimensionality? How do we discover different dimensions? Facing sort of temporality is one, right? When we see the moon, when we watch the moon over a period of time, we see there's a facing that maps onto appearance and disappearance, and I think this is further developed in depictions of nature. And the crux perhaps would be I'm a little bit at loss here. Perhaps could we have a look at page 72 and his discussion of cinema, which I think is very, very interesting. So he starts out by arguing that art or cinema or all new technologies, they should be met with suspicion. And I was wondering, why should we meet them with suspicion? And he says we should meet them with suspicion because they still use a temporal container. And I think when we talk about cinema and Deleuze, what's in mind here is Bergson's critique of cinema as breaking down movement to intervals, right? So, and that's actually something Deleuze would argue against, right? Yes, Bergson didn't like the cinema because it was just a snapshot of time, and it was not a vector as digital cinema or graphic, but it was just increments of time, and that's bad because that's the container. And then he says, yet cinema shows us movement, so he's very much interested in the time movement, but we should be suspicious of it. And then the next movement is, so this whole passage is very irritating to some extent. The next move he does is Wordsworth already had the cinematic regime. Wordsworth anticipated cinema. So we have here a fight between arts, literature versus cinema. And now that Deleuze has privileged cinema as a model of thinking, he intervenes and says, wait a minute, there is a cinematic tradition in literature that predates cinema. So in a way, cinema was a bad thing because it's a container, yet it's somewhat a good thing because it shows us movement. And then he goes even further saying, oh, there's also already a romantic tradition that does that. So, and all this is then defeated by a new type of media, namely the digital regime, or the cinematic versus the numeric, I guess, is at stake. So and so we have sort of almost a paragon of the arts that ultimately leads into what he sort of privileges as the algorithmic approach to recognizing multidimensionality. So there is this trajectory, and I'm not sure what it illustrates is sort of a development of art or aesthetic theory of recognizing increasingly more dimensions in the object, right? So the verbal versus the cinematic versus the numeric, and so forth. And it goes actually back to, so there's always every medium has a sort of points to a new dimension, something that he even maintains for the picturesque, right? I don't know why he invokes Benjamin for this sense of yonderness, but sort of the romantic depiction of landscape in the picturesque mode also has this sort of additional dimensionality, right? Because that may be hinted at in the yonderness, but this yonderness is too metaphysical. Then we have the movement, the internalization of time in the cinematic image, and then it goes even further in the dialectical image. So my question here is, are these all sort of preparatory stages to guide us towards an hyper-objective awareness of things? Or so is there something to be taken from each of these different media, or are these just sort of steps in the way to arrive at the scientific model as the best synthesis of them all, in a way? I'm sorry, that was a very drawn out observation, but that's I think the part I'm struggling with the most, or I find the most revealing about his mode of thinking.
Yes, Christian.
Oh, well, what I noticed by reading both part of the book for our presentation. Oh, well, I forgot. I'm Christian Pasotti, from PhD student, University of Luzern. And well, I noticed that the approach with the hyperobject is always going in different direction. In any case, the thing is the way of the author to guide us. Coming from English literature study, I immediately got struck by the fact he used for the example of the DNA and the RNA, what is the most iconic or one of the most iconic flowers of the English literature, Romanticism. Because if you think about Wordsworth, which is quoted after, we know that he wrote this poem, I Wander Lonely as a Cloud, and I think it's one of the most important poem. And I'm sure that there is a precise direction in this work in order to make us think from at hyperobject coming from different positions, different experience, but in order to resume them. And I think it does the same, but we will see after when it talks about music, because any example of music he uses has a different routing that comes from different position, but which leads not to a common direction, but to a wider way of seeing hyperobjects. That's my opinion, and what I got is not probably a precise answer to Christian's question, but it's my feeling when I think about all this different cultural experience he uses for describing hyperobjects. The fact that he used the daffodil from the scientific point of view, but he probably got it from a romantic literature point of view, or the contrary. The fact he uses the laws as an example, we must not forget that he introduced the topic while referring to the poem of the Mont Blanc, and the two sides of the laws theory of cinema were time and movement, and he probably introduced the movement aspect while describing something that we wrongly, because I use we, but it's quite general, we always perceive a mountain as something that is still. The science and the logic now both tell us no, it's not that eternal static concept. It's movement and time, but he uses it provocatively, in my opinion. That's why he uses the laws. But he uses by introducing a poem that made us quite cheating perceive, oh, the Alps are so still, you know, the commonplace about mountains. That's why we have to pay attention to any quotes in this book, because I think that we have several chunks to be put together when we talk about hyperobjects.
Also, my name is Lisa. I'm a student of Boris and in the Kulturen Alpen Institute, so just starting my PhD. I find what interesting, and I think to Christian's point and also to Eva, I think he's trying to also avoid this binary that there's going to be one access point for everything. So we try to always encapsulate, and I think in this evolution of thinking, that what I also really liked is he talked about this upgrading. So we're trying to upgrade our consciousness to be able to handle these kind of conceptions. And I think time and space is really embedded in the object. He mentions that also, I think, around page 72, that the time and space get encapsulated in. So those exist within the object. And I think thinking about a mountain, not only does it include its material makeup, its form makeup, it includes all our thought processes around what a mountain is. It includes all the history that occurred on that mountain, human and non-human. It occurs all the passage, you know, so that that time and space and conception of the thing gets embedded into the whole object. And to the point of the binaryism, I was also, I don't know if it was specifically in the pages we read, but I was looking a lot at this mind-body problem, and I think that there's also this opportunity to have a monism, so not having the binary and how not to get stuck in that binary, but still allow contradictory things to exist at once, you know, and we can't quite handle that, you know, so I think of, he's also trying to attempt different ways that we can get comfortable with that, or can we get comfortable with that, I think, and this phasing approach. And I think also the tendency to lean towards mathematics is that that has been kind of a tradition of thinking or style of looking that has stayed the same over the centuries, where everything else has kind of evolved. And that way of kind of tackling these issues sort of provides us a certain frame, you know, that can be useful, I think, in allowing these sort of contradictions to exist. So that was, yeah, one option. But I really like that he really kind of also did embed this time and space. And I think the caution also perhaps came from not to get carried away with one approach or another, but really trying to embody all of them, because it's so tempting and sort of very, like you said, yeah, romantic or alluring to get caught into these other ways of thinking, but it just sort of leads us down the same road, trying to condense and conceptualize and categorize. And in this case, we actually need to open and upgrade. So I think that's where the caution came, not necessarily from the fields or genre themselves, but just not to, again, not to go into our usual way of focusing.
Thank you, Lisa. Are you satisfied, Christian or Christians? I mean, I see your point, Christian, first with H. And I'm not so sure about the film, because there is always this mathematical thing, 1 + n. That means it's, I see your agonistic thing between the arts, but, and I'm not so sure if he relies more on science like mathematics. I don't think so. I really don't think so. But isn't it an approach to this hyperobject, and also in order to illustrate how difficult it is, and perhaps that's why he uses films and uses musics, because perhaps they come very near to the hyperobject, but they still remain in the status of objects, don't they?
It seems to me that he's looking at the variety of examples where we discover new dimensions, right? So a poetic approach to the mountains infuses subjectivity onto something that's often considered the opposite, right? So this romantic fallacy. Cinema absorbs time into the object. So so here we have another 1 + n that we discover, and the algorithm is yet another example where we can see where we can look at something that seems very abstract, yet is inevitably tied to the materiality or the object in a classical understanding. I think what all these examples have in common is to enlarge the object and to display the network of objects or things that make up the hyperobject in a way.
Yes.
That's what I gather from it. What I don't understand is his rhetorical maneuvers, right? There seems to be a little like a micro war going on, or he seems to, or maybe it's just making quick references to sort of discourses about these subject matters. I mean, so that's
I really think that's the first. It's really this micro war between the arts. It's a micro war between the objects.
Yeah.
And it's not only, I think so, it's not only quoting from different arts. It's more than that. And that's why I like really this romantic example written by Shelley, because you can say, yes, it's about subjectivity, yes, but his point is it's not about subjectivity, it's about the hyperobject, mountains, this
And
appearing, disappearing, for example.
I agree, and I think so. The intellectual beauty of Schelling of Shelley is somewhat related to the intellektuelle Anschauung of Schelling, and I think that to a large extent is his model of his secret romantic model of the hyperobject, namely to this romantic attempt of fusing what are often considered different faculties of the mind, right? So that this sort of, because the intellektuelle Anschauung or the intellektuelle Anschauung would be this promise of combining language with meta language, right? Of fusing perception with cognition, and all this. I think in adding another dimension to it, perhaps.
Okay. So I just see our time. I want just to proceed to the next topic. So for the next two topics, I have chosen two passages from this chapter, Hypocrises. I decided to distinguish between acting and naming. Before discussing the functioning of language and meta-language, I want to focus on the question, how should we react? As simple as Morton's example is, I mean, it's this small boy who runs in front of an oncoming truck. The reaction to it is complicated. So he suggests three possibilities. The first is this immediate reaction, which conducts to the salvation of the child. Then this hesitation, reflection, which conducts to the death of the child. And then there is this third option that anyway you think there is no chance and there is no action, and anyway the child will be dead. And Morton combines these three reactions with us confronted with hyperobjects. So first, for immediacy, Morton thinks of anti-intellectual or pseudo-Zen evaluation of immediacy over reflection, doing and thinking. There's a thinking. Then second, for hesitation, Morton mentions global warming as a super weak problem. First, because time is running out. Two, because there's no central authority to regulate it. Third, because by seeking the solution to it, you are also creating the problems. And fourth, the policies discount the future irrationally. Here he quotes from Kelly Levin, 2010. And then for the third point, for the reflection that we have no chance, he sees utilitarianism is deeply flawed. As I showed you by these two insights into geohistory last time, in the time scale in global warming. So this time scale in global warming is out of any human experience. And this concerns not only the past, but especially the future. I quote, hyperobjects are messages in bottles from the future. So we have to leave all self-interest theories for economics, for politics, for our daily life. So here he's really crying for theories beyond normative self-interest theories, or as Derek Parfit already states in 1984, I quote, I seemed imprisoned in myself. My life seemed like a glass tunnel through which I was moving faster every year. There's still a difference between my life and the lives of other people, but I am less concerned about the rest of my own life and more concerned about the lives of others. So, ecological awareness, as Morton continues, is intimacy with the alien, let's say, alien in ourselves. At this point, attunement comes into play. And that will also be very important for our last topic. I quote, "Attuning ourselves to the intimacy that hyperobjects demand is not easy. The proximity of an alien presence that is also our innermost essence is very much its structure of feeling." So let's discuss these extracts and the question, how should we react? I just open the second discussion. How should we react?
I had just one very quick thing because it came up yesterday about Corona and the sense of immediacy. So here, this very tiny little virus, it had, you know, with the planes, just as you mentioned, quite immediately we just stopped. And I think no matter how much talking about awareness, all of these things that have been trying, that was quite interesting. A very small fear or a very small thing that created a great fear, or if it was fear or concern or not knowing what was going to happen, I think for the first time in a long time, we were able to see things stop. And there was an immediate action that was taken that has not been done in this way previously. So I think, you know, I mean, wars and different things can provoke that. But I found that quite interesting because we were able to do it. It's not impossible.
Yes.
But, you know, what are the motivations and what are the, what kind of creates that decision? Because it's true, we also see in this the effects that are happening in America at the moment because of the indecision and the inability to act. The effects are much greater and the thing. So I just, just as a small point that I think we were able to actually live through that in the last 4 months to see this, these three choices come up.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Sreten, you were on your way.
Yes, I would like to connect first segment and this one. First of all, I'm not sure we really answered the first question clearly enough, which was the most basic one. What really hyperobject is, and the choice of words by Morton. He is using, for example, this phasing, notion of phasing, which is basically, I understand it, if I want to make it more clear, would be just the issue of scale. And but then because he writes in a very exciting way for me, because he is more developing the text through the choice of words, examples, references, quotes, then are developing argument. And this can be inspiring, but also misleading. And this is why we have a problem to really more clearly define where we are at. No? For example, this hyperobject he mentions at the beginning dream time, Aboriginal dream time. I was not too familiar with this, and I checked a little bit. This is basically mythos of the Aboriginal people, and I couldn't find very direct connection between that example and this issue of scale, which is so crucial, because enormity of it goes beyond the usual dimensional frame in which we live. And also, what I would like to contribute for a more clear approach would be that obviously Morton wants to describe hyperobjects on in several aspects, starting from ontological level, epistemological level, ethical level, aesthetical level, political economy level, etc. So maybe we should think, when we think about it, always to indicate which level we have in mind, and then we will be less confused. For example, now in this second segment, we are talking about ethical level of understanding hyperobjects, no? And how hyperobjects transforms our dominant ethical convictions and attitudes, which he defines as utilitarian, especially by quoting Previšić, for example, and showing that inside utilitarian ethics there is, he's quoting Previšić exactly because Previšić is able to express the limits of utilitarian approach, ethical approach. And for Morton, these limits are much more obvious from the point of view of his concept of hyperobject, of course. And this is where we have these insights of intimacy, relevancy of intimacy, openness, and attuning, what he calls attuning to the alien objects. Objects are alien to us because we cannot transcend our subjectivity. So by default, they are alien to us, but this alienness of the objects are in fact the most intimate essence of our, if we are able not to neglect it. Okay, and in that, being able not to neglect that is the key shift, ethical shift, which is driven by the hyperobject perspective.
Thank you, Sretin. Who wants to add?
I would just like to make one comment on, you started out by saying that these questions are not dialectical, but really, I think you were too modest, and they are very much. When we think about the first approach of the hyperobject, the question of what a hyperobject is so much concerned with the different dimensions or its transdimensionality. So whatever aesthetic approach we take to the hyperobject, we only get one percept of the object. And the important thing is to not just have a cinematic percept or a literary percept or a scientific percept, but to widen the perceptuality of the object and to understand it in its networks. Now, the next step, how should we respond or react to this, really is a result of this transdimensional recognition. So in a way, we are confronted with new affects, right? So cinema gave us an entire new form of experiencing things and ourselves, and as did literature before and science thereafter, or all of them at the same time. It seems to be what he's particularly interested in is once we have an awareness of the transdimensional perceptionality of things, we are also confronted with new bundles and combinations of sensations, right? So this is so every medium creates new affective bundles, and the hyperobject is perhaps the most diverse affective bundle ever, because it basically combines all its relations on an emotive level. So all of a sudden we are confronted with this paradox of an extreme intimate problem that is at the same time a very global one, right? And so the combination of different cognitive attitudes, relations, creates this, what he calls cognitive weirdness, or this, I think, new sensations, basically. And I guess the next step would be to name these sensations and find an adequate language of dealing with them, a language that preserves the multidimensionality of the object's relationships, perhaps in a way.
Thank you, Christian, for leading me to the next topic. So I think we can just continue here. So that's
sorry. I think there are
Veronica.
I think there are other comments coming from Sebastian and Patrick, maybe.
Aha, okay. Patrick?
We don't hear you, Patrick.
Just
1 second. Hello?
Yes, it's okay.
Now. Yeah, okay. I'm starting PhD probably with Boris in Luzern. My name is Patrick. Hi, everybody. I want to I came across this term hypocrisis and this hyperobject the first time. So I had no idea what that is. And when I read this paper, it came in my mind that it sounds for me like another term for metaphysics. It's in different aspects. It's what sorry, I don't know the name of you guys, but what somebody tells before, it's so many things. It's ethical, it's political, it's aesthetical, it's epistemological, it's so many things. And the problem that are described here with space and time, we have nature science called cosmology, also cosmology. That is, it's you can think of that of the biggest hypercrisis problem you can think about, and it's multidimensional. And I want to agree that to try to the question how to react, to break down in different parts. because of course it's very complicated. It will be like at any point it's too complex to go through all these aspects, and in terms of rational understanding the problem, it's always too complex, because this problem is really, it has all these different aspects. So to break down in different like more simplified problems would be, I think, one way to try to go around that, and in different parts like ethical or political and so on. But because the problem is such a huge and big problem that and so complex that it's not, I think it's not possible to to think to get along with that problem, try to combine everything. I mean, it's not, we are not gods. We can't combine everything. We can try to skip it down to different parts, and even that is a lot very complicated. So I had a little bit problems with this text, because I also have not really an idea what this hypo thing is. Hyperobjects is, of course, it's in some parts it's clear, but in the other parts he opens up in so much different ways that I think it gets a little bit indifferent for me, at least.
Okay, thank you for your statement, Patrick. There was another, Sebastian. Is that right? We just have to hear you. Yes, come on.
Okay, perfect. Yes, hello everyone. I'm a postdoc researcher at the Institute of Cultures of the Alps in Altdorf. Yes, and my question is about, if I got it right, for the author, the climate change is a hyperobject, and and he says inside the hyperobject we are always in the wrong. He quotes it, and I thought, towards the questions, what should we do? Does it help to see climate change as a hyperobject? Because as far as I understand it, we know what climate change is, and we know what we should do against it. But the problem is more that the political and the economic system is too hesitant to do the right thing and to make the structural changes. So if we want to discuss climate change as a hyperobject, yes, is it a hyperobject, and why is it a hyperobject? I don't understand that, I think, because yeah, we can measure climate change, and we all, or more or less, we all know what we should or could do against it. So yes, I don't know if it helps to see climate change as a hyperobject.
I think it helps a lot, actually.
Okay.
I can assure you that it helps really a lot, and perhaps.
Boris, can I ask you? Could you maybe just in a few words, for yourself, say why? Why
it helps me?
Yes. Yes.
It doesn't help you, Veronica. Still not.
I mean, it's the danger is there that you strengthen the arguments that argue that we can do nothing against climate change because it's too big, it's too complex. We don't. Yeah, let's.
Actually, yeah, Sebastian, I would agree with you. I really not agree with him, with Morton, but that doesn't mean that the concept hyperobjects doesn't work. For me, it's the opposite, because and this was the point Christian Quendler did. It's about bundling other stories or other perceptions that leads us to another perception of the hyperobject global warming. I wouldn't say climate change, just to this global warming or ocean acidification and so on. So it's really a huge problem, transdimensional and so on. But I think here you can already see that's a text from the years 2010s and so on, because he's stuck somewhere. He's stuck in not acting because it's a Hyperobject problem, this Hyperobject. And here I think he does like a Kurzschluss. He's too fast saying that we are only in the option 3. If you following his 3 options he did in this ethical part. And I just want to react on Patrick. I would really distinguish between hyperobject and metaphysics. I mean, for him, it's the opposite. Metaphysics is like an abstraction. You go, and that's his Hegel point. We will come in the last part. We don't have to mix it up with everything. He's very clear that he's always in the little dimensions, and that's why I think that the example of virus is very good. It's so in this intimacy. It's about your corpse. It's about the alien in your body, and in the same time, it's really it's a global problem. Veronica, what's your point?
I just said that corpse is a dead body, so
yes,
maybe it applies, but
it applies in the future. Who knows? So I just imply futurality.
Yes.
Patrick, add. We need your microphone.
Patrick, you need to.
Yes, I have done nothing, but okay. So for me, it's completely different to try to understand hyperobjects, and there are a lot of hyperobjects, and this specific hyperobject of global warming. And the other question is how to act against it. For me, these are really 2 completely different sections. And if it comes to how to act, then the problem of power is very relevant. And where is that? And if it comes to understand the hyperobject, it's something else. And I guess what I'm feeling in this discussion is more to understand the hyperobject and not really the question how to act against global warming. For me, this is like 2 different problems, and the global warming stuff also what the Corona example is a good example how the power comes into place and threat comes into place, threat of death and so on. And the climate change problem, if it comes to how to react, we have to I think about threats. Can we use threats to act? We need Corona shows us that we need threats to act as a society, and if the threats are spread around globally and not for even region as threatful, then that becomes more difficult to act together. But this is the section how to act, and the other section is what is a hyperobject and how complex is it and how much different epistemological dimensions it has and so on. This, for me, it's a little bit 2 parts.
But Patrick, you see that you are on a binary way, that you don't. I mean, I don't want to criticize you, but I just mentioned that you are that you have like 2 parts. That there is a perception on one hand and there is acting on the other. And I think that's Morton's point: just to bundle action and perception. There are not two different ways. You're right. That's also a question where the power is. But the power is also naming or to name it or not to name it, for example, to give it in a discourse or not to give it in. So here is also our role to act. And that's, I just try to continue to our third part in order not to lose the last part, because the last part is also important, the music part. So I just want to stay not too long on the third part in order to have time for the last part. But is there any addition more for the second part? Because I see you're very engaged when it's about acting, when it's about how to react on the hyperobject. I see Dejan, is that right?
Yes, Dejan Buches from the University of Innsbruck, and I'm currently starting my PhD project, and Christian Quendler is supervising it. And I wanted to add on this notion of metaphysics and the hyperobject, because as you said, Boris, I think for Morton it is the exact opposite. He somehow stems from a weird realism approach. This is a realistic scientific paper, but nonetheless he comes to the same conclusion like other researchers such as Haraway with her Cthulhu scene. We're all in this together, and somehow we have to get cognition, or we have to grasp these challenges that we are faced with. And both, at least as I read them, say that we need some kind of new ethics to get along with these challenges that we are faced with. And for me, this is the crucial point, at least in this few pages we read, that he says we need a new, on page 138, that we need a new idea of how to get along with these immense scales of time and space, and that we need to transcend our self-interests. And here comes in what you said, Sebastian. I don't think that there is a laid out plan how to cope with climate change or global warming. There isn't such a thing as if all the states and politics would agree to do certain things that we could stop climate change. Because of this, what he describes in this paragraph. It is not such a simple solution, and that's why I think the hyperobject is such an intriguing concept, because there are things that are too big and too complex to be solved in simple solutions or in simple causalities, because it's too interconnected and intertwined with many different things.
Okay. Dan, thank you for your statement. So I try to continue now. Christian?
Could I just add a footnote? I think the Corona example is actually not the best example, or an example that sort of shows us the opposite, because it's an example where and Americans are perfect because they're so good in synchronizing in hysteric waves, right? So we have a panic, and the response to Corona is really simple, right? The affect, the emotion it creates is very simple. It's not very complex, right? And that's why we can respond and react perhaps more efficiently than to the larger issue, right? So we can, in the mode of panic, we have a very simple responses, but how do we respond to global warming, right? That doesn't come with the advantages of
if I may just
yes.
To defend Lisa a little bit, I mean, I think her point was that a radical change is possible. We saw this in Corona, and I don't think that the response to Corona is very simple. There is a simple one, but I don't think that it's the only one, right?
Just also this point that probably leads to the next point you're making, Boris. I think it's also, we struggle to deal with anything unknown, you know? So it's like if we, and that's where I think this trying to grasp these hyperobjects, we don't know exactly the effects, we don't know exactly the extent, we don't know exactly the cause. And I think to also these points with science, yes, we have graphs, yes, we have all of this data that we've collected, and it's quite valuable, but we don't understand the extent which that influences all of those things. Our emotions influence that data, that it's much more, I think that's where he's trying to grasp those bundles of things, also has to do with about how we feel about that data. That also impacts all of these things. And I think that's where it does, it's more not necessarily this panic and fear, but also this unknown. You know, are we comfortable with that alien, with that strange stranger that lives with us, with that unknown part? Can we exist with that and accept it? And that part I think we struggle with, because also this Previšić quote, I think was very beautiful about this intimacy. We're so scared to let go of the self. But the thing that we get is if we actually let go of that, we get much more intimate with everything around us and much more comfortable with that alien, that stranger. And that, I think it's not that we have to necessarily it becomes a part of us or we meld or everything becomes everything, but we become more comfortable and that upgrade occurs, I think, somehow in that way.
Okay, thank you for defending yourself, Lisa. Dear people, we have really to continue to our second part on hypocrisies. What is the function of language and meta-language? The feeling, I called it the feeling of unreality. And to go beyond cynicism, I just quote Lacan in order to go straight on. There is no meta-language. Reality is everywhere. The play of illusion and concealment is a symptom of reality. And the language is also part of this reality. Thus, some environmentalist rhetoric, the scorn for mediation, the anti-intellectualism is part of the problem, not the solution. For me, personally, I had really problems with the following pages and with the statement, inside the hyperobject, we are always in the wrong. I mean, it reminds me a little bit too much Adorno's negative dialectic. What I can trace is the unbridgeable gap between soul and world and between ethics and politics. Before discussing the issue, I just point out that that Marxist and anti-Marxist wedded to the game of modernity, that is the problem of the meta position. I have a belief about a belief. So there is always this cynical distance from this top philosophy. That would be this, let's say, transcendental philosophy or something like that. And I conclude with this harsh statement: by thinking rightness and truth as the highest possible elevation, as cynical transcendence, I think Earth and its biosphere as the stage set on which I prance for the amusement and my audience. I like this passage very much. So what do you think? Can you go meta anymore?
Can someone explain to me the prepositional logic or homology between the Kierkegaard quote is against God, we are in the wrong, right? So it's a face-to-face situation that is inadequate or wrong. But then for the hyperobject, he uses the preposition in or within or inside. So that doesn't seem to be the same thing. And I was wondering what you thought or what reasoning is behind this parallelism or asymmetry, perhaps, in his own discourse.
I would have used a different quote from Kierkegaard, honestly. Maybe he avoided because it's too much, it's further into religion. I would have used the concept of leap into faith if I want to stay on Kierkegaard, honestly. Because when we have to act, and I think there is a point, this is connected with what we discussed in the second part, about how to act. It's really a leap into faith if you want to consider the acting against the global warming as a faith. Because what Lisa said about Corona is a perfect example, but it's also true that we still don't know if what we did is correct or not. And the same way, and there are many examples in the second part, I think that Kierkegaard is really an author that connects the two parts. We have several ways on dealing with it, you know, the fact we have to react, but which one is the correct one? He made a list of examples, driving a Prius or etc. And I think that Kierkegaard quote comes by this, the fact of not knowing if acting, which is essential to save the children, is the correct way of doing. Because he used a very precise example, the fact that if I don't do anything, the child is dead. But can we really say the same thing about global warming? That's why I think he used the Kierkegaard, even if I would have used a different quote from him, because it would be more straight to understand the concept of leap into faith.
I very much agree with you. That's what I missed as well a little bit. The concept of faith to be like, it is in there, I think, in this book on many occasions. I in one passage where he talks about data, and the data is actually not helpful because it is also the tool of the counter argument of the deniers. And so this is an argument that you can't resolve, because you will never have the ultimate proof. So you need to desert to a concept like faith, and that is a very intimate thing in a way, because it concerns you and your moral responsibility, which is of course projected to a society or a very, very far future. So it is very I think it's very helpful. And I will tell you just a very concrete example when I had an argument with someone who was, well, not a global warming denier, but who was very much quoting all these well, there is more snow now, I don't know where, so it's not true, and I don't know, and we have to be very pragmatic, and this or these sorts of arguments, and it was a long argument. And the last thing that I said he couldn't answer to, I said I would be with Blaise Pascal, I would say let's I don't know in English, let's vote for the existence of this thing. Let's say that it exists, and let's act like it exists, because we can only win if we do that. And there he was like, okay. So it was a very, very interesting effect that it had on someone who is very much in this concept of we have the data and science and proofs and I don't know, and there it was silence, because it's just, it's the ultimate.
Yeah. But if I can add just a little thing in a nutshell. If we think about that's another example of what I said in the first part of the fact of having these hyperobjects, the confluence of different experience, because now we are dealing with an almost a theological question, I mean, or a philosopher like Kierkegaard, while talking about how to deal with data. And that's a perfect example of what I meant at the beginning about the different experience getting together in the hyperobjects. It's a perfect example, in my opinion.
Patrick?
Yes, I just want to answer about the idea that we have to think on faith with that problem. This relates directly to the role and the power of natural sciences and sciences. And the question would be, for me, why does our society or how our society developed in this situation where natural sciences are losing a little bit or their power? You see that also with the example of the coronavirus and so on. And for me, it's to say, okay, we are in this situation where the natural sciences, they are losing their power and influence, and now we have to go back to faith. It's, I don't know if this is, I would be a little bit skeptical about that idea. Of course, faith is something that is important. Yes, sorry.
No, I just want to tell you that it's in the book that, and I much agree with that, that if you think from the Enlightenment on, how science kind of took a certain space and led us to certain self-evidence, that led us now to this, what he calls the humiliation of man, that we see how we are just in the hyperobject, okay, let's say hyperobject, in this hyperobject, and we cannot do anything really, I mean, in his view, meaningful about it, but try to live or be in this situation and absorb it somehow in a very different way as we perceive other things or perceived other things before. I mean, it leads it is a natural conclusion of the scientific thinking to go beyond the scientific thinking and realize that we don't have that power that scientific thinking attributed to us. I think that is what I call faith. I mean, maybe, I mean, we could give it another name so that it doesn't get confused with the religious idea of faith, but it is something in the same, how to say, the same, that the essence is very, very similar, I think.
Yes, thank you, Veronica, for your
I didn't introduce myself. I'm Veronica.
You just quoted Pascal, yes. Yes. So if you don't feel very well in your skin, so just quote Blaise Pascal from the Pensées. I think perhaps we can relate to faith if you use this attunement thing. And that's why I just want to proceed to our last and fourth part. And in order to position ourselves more exactly, we have to follow not only the Hegel dialectic art history, but to be aware what music tells us about our relationship to ourselves and to the biosphere. So it's really about intimacy and global, as for example, global warming or global virus, whatever. So let's come to our last part. On although let's begin with Hegel's phases in his Vorlesungen über die Philosophie der Kunst. So we have this gap between the idea and the attitude it codes for. And the first phase for him, it's this Gothic medieval phase, symbolic phase, where the spirit is dwarfed by materials. So it leads us to religion as the main thing. And then you have the classical thing. So I mean, it's not my opinion, just refer to Hegel, or as Morton refers to Hegel. And the second part is, let's say, Mozart and Haydn, the symmetry between the material and the thoughts, this, yes, the classical music. And then you have to shift to the romantic phase, where you have the discovering of the infinity of inner space, and the lead is not anymore with the arts. It's, I mean, yes, Hegel is philosopher, so it's philosophy which leads everything and which leads to the failing of art. As Hegel could be all right in his analysis of the epochs, we should be aware that Hegel's theological vision is a symptom of modernity. And in the romantic art, we have a problem, and I think it's really very good if you also take the Foucault, how do you call that, Foucault's definition for the modern times, where art becomes deeply story-shaped, as artists realize that since they can't directly express spirit, they must tell the story of the failure to express it. And I think here we reached a point where I want to pass the words to my research group about musical attunement. With the following picks, I only mentioned the dimension of the musical problem since the 19th century. So first, the absolute equal temperament in order to use the piano as big sound machine in the big concert hall. Or as music theorists of the last years state, how equal temperament ruined harmony and why you should care. Actually, it's I like this book. It's written, I just can recommend you this book. If you are in music anyway, you have to read it. And you also can see the orchestra as the sound industry. Yes, here you can just see Scriabin's mystical chord in order to discover all colors of the well-tempered piano. And you can see also the orchestra as the sound industry and the director as the big dictator, thinking that he handles the whole music. But if you played in the orchestra, you know that that's not the case, as the biosphere has its own dynamics. And that's the point where Cage comes in. Here, I like this picture very well because you see how he listens to the piano and how he prepares it in order to give it other sounds. And last but not least, Lamont Young, the well-tuned piano. That's a work in progress since 1964. So it's not anymore about stories. So it's the music of attunement, not of stories. The music doesn't want to tell us a story, but about what's about attunement. And what does that mean? I mean, I like Lamont Young very well, but that's my own story. But just this first piece for David Tudor, bring a bale of hay and a bucket of water onto the stage for the piano to eat and drink. the performer may then feed the piano or leave it or to eat by itself. If the former, the piece is over after the piano has been fed. If the latter, it is over after the piano eats or decides not. For me, it's a typical Lamontian piece. So you can do everything, but here it's really about attunement. It's about objectivity and subjectivity mixed up in a bundle that you have really to attune the different visions of the 18th, 19th, 20th century of music. Yes, that's the point to start to our final discussion, to conclude our discussion. And I really want to hear also my postdocs from my attunement project.
Yes, here's the first one. Good morning, everyone. I'm Silvan, and I work as a postdoc researcher in Boris's project about the musical concepts of tuning and polyphony in Luzern. Yes, and in my dissertation, I dealt a lot with tuning systems of the 17th and early 18th century. So I was quite astonished to find this account of tuning and temperament theory now in a text about global warming and hyperobjects. Apparently, Timothy Morton's father is a professional musician. That may explain his affinity to music and also music theory in a personal way. On a theoretical level, Morton's argument, this idea of music being a mirror of social, or in this case, ecological history, reminded me a lot of Adorno. I was really thinking to read Adorno in this passage there. But on the other hand, of course, the figure of tuning and the connection to the cosmos has also a very long tradition in the antique European concept or theory of world harmony. And I was a bit surprised that Morton isn't reflecting on this historical roots of his arguments, because also now thinking about the discussion we previously had, it could be very interesting to compare like this pre-modern thinking of world harmony with also this thought that everything is connected, and also this melting of faith and science and acting, and to Morton's concept of the hyperobject. Also to work out the differences, of course, because there are crucial differences, but there are also some parallels in these two ways, in these two concepts of the world harmony and of the hyperobject. Yeah, this is one point I want to bring in the discussion.
Thank you, Silvan. Yes, but I mean, you're right, but not everybody can handle it like you in this precise historical way. But you're right. I mean, his point is really historical, and he could go further back to the 17th and 18th century, because it shows that that the piano isn't a machine, and especially in Bach's wohltemperiertem Klavier, there you have it's not about the piano itself. It's not clear if it's for a cembalo or for the first Hammerklavier or something like that, or organ. It's not clear. But his point, Bach's point, is about the tuning of the soul and of the body. So there you have really you have on one hand this mathematical machine science thing when you speak about attunement, but on the other you have always this intimacy to your own body, to your own thinking, in the historical way to think about harmony. And that's why I'm so curious. What do you think, you others, about attunement argument given by Morton.
Just one, I thought it was, he sort of anticipates this moment already in the facing chapter when he talks about Jimi Hendrix's use of the face paddle,
yes,
which I thought was a little bit funny. But it makes clear, to me at least, is that, so meta language is an illicit form of, is an illicit synthesis of facing, right? So what meta language does is that it sort of synthesizes different faces, and thereby maybe draws a conclusion that lacks. And I think this is where the harmony or the musical part comes in, or the attunement comes in as a counter model to sort of intellectual deduction or reasoning in a way. So I thought there was an interesting, at least that's what I take as a cue from the facing chapter, right? So when you use the face pedal to open and restrict the resonance of your harmonies or chords in a way.
Yes, Sebastian?
No, sorry. Yeah.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I have a question also to ask about this attunement, because I think also related to my topic with the amoeba and this kind of flexibility and adjustment, because I see that also in relation to the hyperobject is, and again, this kind of upgrading our ways of behaving and adjusting and kind of constantly adapting. So again, I think as humans, we want to, and I think your question also, Christian, about being of or in the world. Karen Barad talks about this a lot, and I think it also is our perception of, and Tim Ingold also speaks about this in his ways of kind of that we have kinesthetic relation with the world. So it's reacting to us as much as we're reacting it to it, and there is that we are really in the world, you know, versus being of the world and kind of not this separate entity acting upon something. So with this attunement, I wonder in some ways it's sort of, and again, being cautious of sort of these flux theories or this kind of things, but kind of attuning ourselves, adapting ourselves, and it's a constant adjustment. So there is not one fixed way, but it's a constant kind of gathering of this information, processing and sort of moving ahead. And Timothy Morton also talks about this process philosophy. So I'm just questioning, because I sort of tend to put those together in that language. So this sort of attunement, this adapting, this adjusting, you know, that there's a flexibility that occurs to kind of reach these fine moments. But those fine moments, if I think about an instrument, change dependent on temperature, dependent on humidity, dependent on that. The tuning is constantly also kind of in this flux. And it's not that you have to have less integrity. Do you know? I think the integrity still holds high, but there really has to be an inherent flexibility. And I think with these hyperobjects, that's the same thing, is that we want to categorize, we want to capsulate and kind of get a moment that we have attuned. But I don't know if, I think those moments are very fleeting and never actually reachable. And that's what we struggle with, is that there is how to kind of interweave in this and reach these moments of integrity. But again, they'll be fleeting and we have to attune again. So it's this kind of constantly, there's sort of also with this action, this ability to act, is that movement never ceases in a way in this attunement. So there's not a reachable point when now we're finally tuned. I think that's, yeah, again, I don't know if that's correct in the musical language, but at least from my experience, it seems like it's a constant, it's a constant thing. So that it's thinging, it's never done, you know, in a sense.
Christian.
Well, to me, it was very interesting part of the of our reading, because I noticed how, and I think it's very important point, that the path that led us to Cage and Lamont Young, as it's described by the author, has two very important aspects. First, he underlines the fact that we got over the period that starts between the, let's say, the last 2 centuries, where the written word took over music, and it's not a new concept. Also, Levi-Strauss underlined how with the leader meant is a German word, the lead, the sang music, basically uproots the essence of music as autonomous form. And now, getting through this new music, we basically got back to a period where we got over the Anthropocene, because he underlines in the text how this changing in music arrived in the same period of the Industrial Revolution, the Anthropocene, and that's very interesting aspect. And I was wondering why, but I think that's already the answer. He basically skipped all those composers who basically didn't get over the word, which is a very human aspect, but melted music with another very human aspect, which is architecture. I noticed that he basically didn't quote authors or composers like Xenakis or Barres, those who were into architecture, and I think that's very interesting aspect, because he really wanted to get over that period that has been in coincidence with Anthropocene taking over, and the fact that Anthropocene is basically took over in the same period where the word, which is an essence of the human being, got over the music. I found a very interesting coincidence for the concept of attunement.
Yes.
For me, this part of the text was also exciting, and I would summarize my excitement of it in this sentence. It's about, rather than equipment delivering the music, now the music delivers the equipment. So this switch, he is referring for me as an example of this revolutionary or paradigmatic switch, which he is invoking throughout the whole text. And trick is here that, is it connected with hyperobject and Anthropocene or not? Is this what just Christian mentioned? Is this just correlation that piano building and steam engine building was simultaneous, approximately, historically? No. So is it correlation, or is it causality there, some kind of? So it's not clear, at least because I didn't read the whole book. It's not clear for me if this connection is established more argumentatively persuasive than just this correlation. So, but I would like to try to understand better how this switch takes place inside music itself, regardless of this relation to hyperobject concept or not. So So in his analysis, as I quoted, it's instrument before instrument was delivering the music, now the music delivers the instrument. And for him, this is important because this is switch of the key point to the object. The instrument, the equipment as an object. So this is epistemological, aesthetical, and ontological shift taking place, if I understand him. This is why he insists on it as a kind of, again, a proof for his convictions and attitudes of the primacy of objects. And the problem with that I see in a way that it's not only the relation between music and the instrument, because in both periods of epochs, first one when instruments was delivering music, and also in the second one after the shift when music delivers instrument, one key player or factor is not mentioned there, and that is the artist who is doing both things there. It's not some abstract music delivered by instrument. And on the after the shift, vice versa of that. It's always in both cases somebody is behind that, who is writing music for the instrument and the audience in the first epoch, and then after the shift just switches the perspective. But we must not lose him or her from the picture and from the analysis, if we want to be really true to what's going on there, you know. Otherwise, it will be again just very exciting and inspirational, but somehow also misleading example, as many others which he uses.
Sebastian, we need your audio.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I want to quickly refer to the phrase that he wrote on, that he writes on page 167. Strings and generators have been liberated from telling human story. They tell their own story, pronounce their own doom. And with that quote, I get it why climate change is, it's important to see it as a hyper object, because when you see it like in this way, then you can understand that nature is not an instrument or that human can control and that tells a human story. So humans are not above nature; they're in nature. They're part of nature, and so nature tells its own story. And we have to, if we want to cope with global warming, then we have to really be careful and listen to nature as what this force says, and how we as humans can control it. I think that's it's a beautiful analogy. But
I see you are still skeptical towards this coincidence between attunement and the story of attunement since the invention of the steam machine. But I can, or perhaps Silvan, you can just underline that his argument, if you argue historically, is more and more, how to call it, pertinent. isn't it?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And to your point, Regan, of course, you're right that also behind the tuning system, there's an artist or a person who makes the tuning. But I think Morton's argument here is that the just intonation tuning system is like reflecting a natural state of tuning, because just intonation means that the musical intervals are composed like the natural ratios, the physical ratios, how they occur in nature. That would be the argument of Morton. And the temperament is something that humans did to the tuning system in order to modulate, to be able to switch between different tonalities. So I think this is the argument that for him, just intonation is like a natural state of the tuning system, where no human being is behind.
I would be very cautious with this about the nature, because also one premise of Timothy Morton, also what he's written before, and something I think as we continue on, nature, I mean, in this sense, he doesn't call it a hyperobject, but we tend to regard there is a natural state and then there's something when humans intervene. And again, this making wrong of us, that we assume, and also Gaia, there's all of this, you know, by being here, we are messing up something. You know, and that is an assumption, I think, just to put a caution out, because I think this line of thinking prohibits us from going further and raising a certain consciousness or awareness and exploring more things. And it's so it's such a natural tendency to talk in this way, but I think it really limits our ability to think, to expand our thinking, is because we have a very, very attached idea. And I think also that's where I have sometimes issues with Anthropocene as well, is we make ourselves wrong. And I'm very curious as to why. And we call it a problem, and there is something happening, but we're so quick to make ourselves wrong and also say that there is something natural and something artificial and man-made and make these distinctions. And there's much written on this, but I think this is something as we continue on in these symposiums, the caution of that, because also Timothy Morton is trying to also take away this concept of nature, you know, and he doesn't use it as a hyperobject, which I think is interesting, because it's it's very much about our languaging, but also there is a lot of, what did you say, all these subtleties and these sensibilities attached to this way of thinking.
Lisa, sorry for interrupting you, but I think just the notion nature in the musical context was misleading. Natural means just mathematical, a simple ratio between, for example, 1 to 2 is an octave, 2 to 3 is quint, and so on. It's nothing about nature. It's about the natural ratio for the musical temperament, which is called natural. And actually this was discussed during the 18th century. What is natural? Is it the tempered, or is it the, how do you call that, mitteltönige Stimmung, and so on. So you have this big discussion, and there was also this big discussion why the intervals cannot be equal one to the other, because they already saw the problem of this machine-like music, and they didn't like it at all. So it's not directly binded to nature, but it's binded to this, what Christian told us in the beginning, it's to these bundles. How do you bundle? Can you say that, bundle? Bundle body and your environment. How do you bundle your perception and your ethics, for example? I just want to show you that we have, because it's also historically already discussed, we have to be very cautious if we use the term natural or nature, because it's highly condensed and historically loaded, and we have always to define from where we use it, in which context. And if we tell in the musical sense, it's natural, it's a natural ratio, so it doesn't mean at all that it has anything to do with Gaia, for example, just to be clear. And that's why it's so striking, his argument about attunement.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying, because that's I was thinking along similar lines. So the chest, I don't know the terminology either,
Yeah,
but
the
chest attunement is in fact the first scientific engineering of music. So you take the physical frequencies, and then you have a perfect third or whatever interval. And so only on the assumption that the chest or absolute attunement is correct, playing the well-tempered piano, you're always wrong, basically, right? Whenever, or you whenever, yeah. So here in fact, the well-tempered piano is a hyperobject, right? That way, when you use it, you're always playing wrong. And some musicians sometimes they retune, right? So they can play a perfectly pitched interval. But then if we follow this logic, then how does Cage's intervention liberate us? Really?
Because it's the materiality itself. It's the material, the strings, all the screws he puts in, and it's not. His point isn't it should sound like this and this, like this mystical Scriabin chord. Right. So for me, the Scriabin chord is just the opposite of Cage's, just hearing the material. I think that's the point. What Satan, how did you call that? It's the switch from the music to the material. What?
The instrument, the music that comes from the instrument versus.
There is a switch. I mean, this is quote from him. It's not anymore that equipment delivers music. Now music delivers equipment, and equipment meaning object or something material, like you said. Mm-hmm. But this is again bringing back us to ontological level and what is metaphysical and what is not. I mean, me personally, I have reserve, how to say, I don't trust Morton on this level much, or any of those triple O philosophers, because in my view they are kind of regression, even not to reach the level of Hume and Kant, and not to mention everything after that. You know, the arguments by Hume and Kant are devastating for such metaphysical attitudes. These assumptions of non-human external reality and all of that. So, but anyway, regardless of my personal affinities in ontology, I like his clear, sharp eye to recognize examples. In this case, this with piano, which supports his idea in a telling way. And here it is this switch, how this switch to the object is possible. Example from the field of music, but it is nice example, but it is not the whole story, as I said already.
But it can never be the whole story.
Of course. In every other approach, if you use argument or example or whatever, you will always emphasize one side and neglect the other in order to support your perspective and your point. It's normal like that. I don't mind that. This is why I also always say that it's exciting for me to read him, regardless of my some critical points.
Okay. So I think I should play it bad Swiss guy in order to conclude now. It's 12 o'clock, time for eating and everything. Thank you very much that you followed us these 2 sessions with Morton Feldman's Hyperobjects, and I'm sure that you will encounter more and more hyperobjects in your world, and I'm sure for that he gives us some hints how to handle it more openly and not to follow always our thinking as we learned it before, because it's always about new combinings. And that's, for me, that's the refreshing part of Morton's writings, because I'm not, as you said, and I'm not always with him, but I see the way of thinking is very fruitful.
Yes.
So thank you very much for everything, for your presence, for your arguments and thoughts. And I really would like to continue it. And perhaps the next time our Innsbruck partner will propose us some text in order to discuss it. I'm really looking forward. So, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.